March 17th, 1943. Shimata City Research Facility, Shizuoka Prefecture, Japan. Steam rises from teacups as Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi adjusts his thick-rimmed glasses and stares at the blueprints spread across the laboratory table. Outside, cherry blossoms drift past reinforced windows, but inside this converted textile factory, 23 Japanese scientists and engineers work under strict military secrecy on something that shouldn't exist, a weapon that kills with invisible energy. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shimada of the Imperial Japanese Navy stands rigid near the doorway, his uniform crisp despite the humid coastal air. He's been assigned to Project Kugo, ku for the first syllable of kuki, meaning air, and go for weapon, a directive that came directly from Naval Technical Research Headquarters in Tokyo 3 months earlier. The mission parameters are clear, but seemingly impossible. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint. Controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Develop an electromagnetic weapon capable of killing enemy combatants at ranges between 100 and 1,000 feet. The inspiration isn't purely Japanese innovation. Intelligence reports from Europe speak of German scientists working on similar directed energy concepts. Experiments led by men like Ernst Schiebold, who believe electromagnetic radiation can be weaponized beyond mere radio jamming. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. American inventor Nikola Tesla had publicly boasted before the war about death ray capabilities, claims that sparked both ridicule and secret military interest across multiple nations. Now, with Allied forces advancing across the Pacific and American B-29 superfortresses beginning their development for long-range bombing campaigns, Japanese military leadership demands unconventional solutions. Yagi, already renowned for his pioneering work on directional antennas, the Yagi-Uda antenna, that would ironically be adopted by Allied forces for radar systems, leads the theoretical aspects of the project. His counterpart, Chief Engineer Masao Ito, focuses on the practical challenge that dominates every conversation in the facility, building a magnetron powerful enough to concentrate lethal doses of microwave radiation into a focused beam. The magnetron itself isn't new technology. British scientists at Birmingham University had developed the cavity magnetron in 1940, revolutionizing radar capabilities. Japanese engineers obtained technical intelligence about these developments through various channels before Pearl Harbor, And now they're attempting to scale the concept to unprecedented power levels. The mathematics are brutal. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. To generate enough electromagnetic energy to disrupt biological functions, specifically to heat tissue to lethal temperatures or interfere with neural activity, requires sustained microwave exposure at intensities far beyond anything currently achievable with portable equipment. The calculations show it's theoretically possible, Dr. Yagi explains to Lieutenant Commander Shimada during an early morning briefing, his finger tracing equations on a chalkboard. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Microwave radiation at sufficient intensity can cause dielectric heating of water molecules in organic tissue, but the power requirements, he trails off, shaking his head. The engineering challenges stack like obstacles in a fortress approach. First, generating sufficient power requires massive electrical infrastructure. Generators, transformers, cooling systems, equipment that would fill an entire railway car. Second, focusing the beam demands precision manufacturing of waveguides and reflectors that Japanese industry, already strained by wartime material shortages, struggles to produce. Third, and most critically, the inverse square law of electromagnetic radiation means that doubling the distance reduces power intensity by a factor of 4. What might be lethal at 100 feet becomes barely noticeable at 200 feet. Yet the work proceeds. By late spring, the Shimada facility successfully constructs a prototype magnetron, producing 100 kilowatts of continuous microwave power, an achievement that would be remarkable even in peacetime. The device fills an entire room, requires a dedicated diesel generator, and produces enough waste heat that engineers install auxiliary cooling systems to prevent the equipment from destroying itself. The focusing apparatus, a parabolic reflector manufactured from precious aluminum alloy, stands 6 feet in diameter and must be manually aimed like an artillery piece. The first test targets are non-living, wooden targets to measure beam concentration, metal plates to assess heating effects, electronic equipment to observe electromagnetic interference. Results are encouraging but modest. At 50 feet, the beam can ignite dry paper after prolonged exposure. At 100 feet, it produces measurable temperature increases in water-filled containers. Then comes the proposal that changes everything: biological testing. June 14, 1943. Shimada City Research Facility, Testing Ground 3. The morning humidity hangs thick over the converted agricultural field behind the research complex. Senior technician Kenji Watanabe secures the final connection on the magnetron housing, while two junior engineers maneuver the massive parabolic reflector into position on its wheeled mount. 30 meters away, exactly 98. 4 feet. A white rabbit sits motionless in a wire mesh cage, oblivious to the role it's about to play in military history. Dr. Yagi stands beside a makeshift observation post, a concrete barrier erected specifically to shield personnel from potential electromagnetic exposure. In his hand, a stopwatch. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Shimada holds a leather-bound logbook, fountain pen ready. They've conducted dozens of equipment tests over the past 3 months, measuring power output, beam coherence, thermal effects on inanimate objects. But this morning marks the first attempt to determine whether Project Kugo can actually fulfill its lethal promise. The technical specifications that brought them to this moment represent months of incremental progress. The current magnetron generates approximately 30 kilowatts of continuous microwave power at a frequency near 375 megahertz, state-of-the-art for 1943, though primitive by later standards. The wavelength, roughly 80 centimeters, falls within the range that laboratory analysis suggested could cause biological damage. Earlier small-scale tests on mice showed promise. Exposure to concentrated microwave energy at close range produced observable tissue heating and, in some cases, internal hemorrhaging. But mice aren't battlefield targets. The question demanding answer today is whether this technology can scale to tactically relevant distances. 30 meters might not seem impressive for a weapon system. Rifle bullets travel that distance in a fraction of a second. But if the principle proves sound, engineering improvements could extend the range. That's the hope, anyway, driving this humid morning's experiment. Generator steady, narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle, emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Generator stable, calls out Watanabe from his position near the diesel engine that powers the entire apparatus. The deep rumble of the generator fills the testing ground, drowning out the morning cicadas. Magnetron temperature nominal, ready for power-up on your order, Doctor. Dr. Yagi exchanges a glance with Lieutenant Commander Shimada. There's no ceremony in this moment, no grand declarations, just the methodical progression of scientific inquiry applied to the darkest of purposes. Begin test sequence, Yagi announces, his voice carrying across the testing ground. Mark time. Shimada's thumb presses the stopwatch. Click. 0 minutes, 0 seconds. The equipment hums to an almost imperceptible higher pitch as Watanabe advances the power controls. The magnetron, enclosed in its copper housing with cooling water circulating through external jackets, begins generating the invisible beam of microwave radiation. The parabolic reflector focuses this energy into a concentrated column of electromagnetic force aimed directly at the rabbit's cage. To the human eye, nothing appears to happen. No visible beam, no dramatic spark, no theatrical display of power. Just a rabbit in a cage 30 meters away, continuing to sit motionless, whiskers twitching occasionally. 1 minute passes. The rabbit begins grooming itself, entirely unaware. 2 minutes. Dr. Yagi adjusts his glasses, leaning forward slightly. The rabbit's movements seem normal. 3 minutes. One of the junior engineers shifts his weight, uncertain what he's supposed to be observing. The rabbit nibbles at something in the cage. 4 minutes. Now there's a change, subtle at first. The rabbit's movements become less coordinated. It tries to groom, but misses, paw swiping past its ear. Then it sits very still, but not with the casual alertness of a healthy animal. This is the stillness of distress. 5 minutes. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. The rabbit topples onto its side. Its legs move in weak, uncoordinated spasms. Continue exposure, Dr. Yagi orders, his voice clinical. Detached. This is data collection, nothing more. Emotion has no place in military research. 8 minutes. The spasms have stopped. The rabbit lies motionless. 10 minutes. Cease transmission, Yagi commands. Watanabe pulls the power control to 0. The generator's pitch drops. The invisible beam disappears. The rabbit remains utterly still in its cage. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint. Controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Dr. Yagi approaches slowly, Shimada close behind. They reach the cage and peer inside. The rabbit is dead. No external wounds, no burns, no obvious trauma, but unmistakably dead. Yagi opens the cage and carefully removes the small body, still warm. His experienced hands probe gently, assessing. Preliminary examination suggests internal damage, he reports to Shimada. We'll need to conduct a complete necropsy. The autopsy later that afternoon reveals what theoretical calculations predicted. Massive internal hemorrhaging, particularly in the lungs. The microwave energy, absorbed by water molecules in the tissue, generated intense, localized heating deep inside the body. Blood vessels ruptured, organs cooked from the inside. Death by electromagnetic radiation. Invisible, silent, and after 10 minutes of exposure, completely effective at 30 meters. For Lieutenant Commander Shimada, recording every detail in his logbook, the implications are both exciting and sobering.
They've proven the concept works. Kugo can kill. But 10 minutes of exposure time against a stationary target at less than 33 yards, against American soldiers advancing through jungle terrain, or bomber crews flying at altitude, or naval personnel aboard ships, the weapon's tactical limitations are immediately apparent, even to an optimistic military observer. The testing continues through summer 1943.
Groundhogs replace rabbits as test subjects. Larger animals, more robust physiology. The results are grimly consistent but discouragingly slow. A groundhog requires 20 minutes of continuous exposure at 30 meters before succumbing. 20 minutes, an eternity in combat, where engagements are measured in seconds and survival depends on immediate response. September 1944. Shimada Research Facility, Conference Room. General Tsuyoshi Kusaba sits at the head of a scarred wooden table, his jaw tight as Dr. Yagi presents the latest round of test results. Behind him, technical diagrams cover the walls, schematics of magnetron configurations, beam propagation calculations, thermal effect projections. The atmosphere in the room carries the weight of 18 months of research that has produced precisely one undeniable conclusion. September 1944. Shimada Research Facility, Conference Room.
The Kugo weapon, in its current form, is tactically worthless. 10 minutes to neutralize a rabbit at 30 meters, Kusaba repeats, his voice flat. 20 minutes for a groundhog. He doesn't need to state the obvious, that American infantry don't stand motionless in open fields waiting to be irradiated, that combat occurs at ranges far beyond 30 meters, that wars are won by weapons that kill in seconds, not minutes. Yet abandoning the project isn't an option that Kusaba seriously considers. By autumn 1944, Japan's strategic situation has deteriorated catastrophically. American forces have recaptured the Philippines. B-29 superfortresses now operate from the Mariana Islands, bringing Japanese cities within bombing range. Conventional weapons aren't turning the tide. The military leadership, increasingly desperate, demands miracles from science. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. If Kugo cannot work today, then engineering must make it work tomorrow. Dr. Yagi proposes an ambitious redesign. Instead of a single 30-kilowatt magnetron, the weapon should employ multiple magnetrons operating in parallel, their outputs combined and focused through a significantly larger parabolic reflector. The Japanese radio company, already stretched to breaking point supporting radar production and radio communications for the military, receives orders to develop these components. The target specifications are daunting. 4 magnetrons, generating a combined output between 250 and 300 kilowatts, feeding a reflector measuring 10 meters in diameter, over 30 feet of precision metalwork at a time when aluminum and skilled labor are desperately scarce. The theoretical calculations suggest this scaled-up version might kill a rabbit at 1 kilometer distance in 10 minutes. 1 kilometer. Finally, a tactically meaningful range, though the 10-minute exposure time remains an insurmountable obstacle. How do you keep an enemy soldier stationary for 10 minutes? The answer, explored in classified tactical assessments, involves scenarios so contrived they border on fantasy. Ambush positions where enemy forces are somehow pinned down, unable to move or seek cover, while the Ku-Go operator maintains perfect beam alignment. Even if those conditions could be achieved, the weapon faces fundamental physics limitations. The inverse square law governing electromagnetic radiation propagation means that quadrupling the distance from 30 meters to 120 meters requires 16 times the power to maintain equivalent energy density at the target. Extending range to 1 kilometer demands astronomical power increases that push magnetron technology beyond anything achievable with 1940s materials science. The copper components overheat, the vacuum seals fail, the electrical insulation breaks down under voltage stress. Engine disablement tests produce equally discouraging results. In theory, concentrated microwave energy should interfere with ignition systems, disrupt electrical circuits, perhaps even induce currents strong enough to damage engine components. In practice, testing against exposed aircraft engines shows marginal effects unless the beam operates at ranges measured in inches, not feet. A fully assembled aircraft, with its engine enclosed in cowling and surrounded by metal structures that inadvertently shield against electromagnetic radiation, proves nearly immune to Ku-Go's effects at any tactically relevant distance. Through late 1944 and into early 1945, work continues on the multi-magnetron configuration. Engineers at the Shimada facility solve one technical problem, only to encounter 3 more. Power distribution networks to feed 4 magnetrons simultaneously require custom-designed electrical systems. Synchronizing the magnetron's output phases to prevent destructive interference demands precision timing equipment that Japan's electronics industry struggles to manufacture. The 10-meter reflector, when partially completed, proves so massive that mobility becomes impossible. The weapon system would require a dedicated installation, vulnerable to air attack and incapable of tactical repositioning. April 1945, Tokyo. American B-29s have burned vast sections of the capital to ash. The Imperial Japanese Navy has been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in protected harbors.
The army fights desperate defensive battles on Okinawa, bleeding itself white against overwhelming American firepower. In this context, research funding for exotic weapons systems becomes increasingly difficult to justify. Kugo receives its final allocation of resources, not because military leadership believes the weapon will change the war's outcome, but because abandoning hope entirely is psychologically unacceptable. At Shimada, Dr. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Yagi and his team work with materials that arrive sporadically, when they arrive at all. The multi-magnetron configuration exists primarily on paper and in partially assembled prototypes that can't achieve full power output. Testing has stopped. There are no more test animals. Food shortages have made rabbits and groundhogs more valuable as protein sources than as experimental subjects. The diesel fuel that powered the generator now gets diverted to military vehicles. The researchers know, though few speak it aloud, that Kugo has failed. July 15th, 1945. Shimada Research Facility, 11:47 p.m. The air raid sirens remain silent tonight, but Dr. Yagi works by candlelight anyway. Electricity rationing has reduced power availability to a few hours per day, and those precious hours must be reserved for critical equipment testing. On his desk, calculations sprawl across sheets of increasingly poor quality paper, the wood pulp content so high that his fountain pen bleeds through the fibers. He's attempting to solve an equation that has no solution. How to make Kugo operationally viable before Japan's inevitable defeat. The latest test results, conducted 3 weeks ago with the last available diesel fuel, showed marginal improvement. The reconfigured multi-magnetron system, operating at only 60% of designed capacity due to component failures, managed to kill a rabbit at approximately 900 meters, nearly 1,000 yards, in 5 minutes of continuous exposure. On paper, this represents dramatic progress from the original 30-meter, 10-minute baseline. In battlefield reality, it remains hopelessly impractical. 5 minutes. Yagi circles the number on his worksheet. 5 minutes for a stationary target in optimal conditions with perfect beam alignment and no atmospheric interference. He spent enough time around military officers to understand combat dynamics. Enemy soldiers move. They take cover. They return fire. No American infantryman would obligingly stand motionless for 5 minutes while invisible radiation cooked him from the inside. The weapon's fundamental premise, that targets could be held in place long enough for lethal exposure, has never been realistic. The range extension to 1,000 yards came at extraordinary cost. The final magnetron configuration required so much electrical power that the diesel generator system, already taxed beyond design limits, suffered catastrophic failure during the last full power test. Replacement parts don't exist. The manufacturing facilities that could produce them have been destroyed by American bombing raids or converted to produce more immediately necessary military equipment. The massive parabolic reflector, partially completed, sits in a storage building, its polished aluminum surface tarnished by humidity and neglect. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima. Lieutenant Commander Shimada, temporarily reassigned to naval coordination duties, witnesses the flash that changes everything. The single American B-29 that appeared over Hiroshima at 8, a deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone, slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery, with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. 15 a.m. delivered not a conventional bomb, but something inconceivably more powerful. A weapon that released the energy equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT in a fraction of a second. The blast wave shatters windows 15 kilometers away. The mushroom cloud climbs to 18,000 meters. Thermal radiation ignites fires across the city. By evening, Hiroshima has effectively ceased to exist as a functioning urban center, and tens of thousands are dead or dying. News reaches Shimada facility by August 8th. Dr. Kushma Kell. Yagi and his team gather around a radio, listening to fragmentary reports that speak of unprecedented destruction, of a single bomb creating devastation that would require hundreds of conventional raids. The phrase atomic bomb means little to most listeners. Nuclear physics remains an esoteric specialty. But the strategic implications are immediately clear. America possesses a weapon that makes all conventional military calculations obsolete. The atomic bomb kills instantly, across vast areas, delivered from altitudes beyond conventional anti-aircraft defense. Ku-go, by contrast, requires 5 minutes of continuous exposure to kill a single target at 1,000 yards, assuming that target remains perfectly stationary. The comparison isn't merely unfavorable, it's absurd. One technology represents the culmination of theoretical physics and industrial engineering operating at the absolute frontier of human capability. The other represents desperate improvisation, constrained by inadequate resources and fundamental physical limitations. August 9, 1945. A second atomic bomb destroys Nagasaki. 3 days after Hiroshima, America demonstrates that the first weapon wasn't a singular achievement, but a reproducible technology. Japan's military position, already desperate, becomes utterly untenable. The Soviet Union declares war and invades Manchuria with overwhelming force. The strategic calculus that has driven Japanese resistance, hope that inflicting sufficient casualties might secure negotiated peace terms, collapses. There will be no negotiation, only surrender or annihilation. At Shimada facility, work on Project Kugo effectively ends, though no formal termination order arrives. The researchers simply stop showing up. Some are called away to emergency assignments.
Others flee to family members in rural areas, away from cities that might be targeted by atomic weapons. Dr. Yagi remains, but without electrical power, without fuel, without functioning equipment, there's nothing productive to do. He organizes the research documentation, creating detailed technical reports that describe what was attempted, what was achieved, and why it failed. These documents, he believes, might have historical value, even if they possess no military utility. The Empire's radio broadcast announcing surrender comes at noon on August 15, 1945. Dr. Yagi listens in his empty laboratory, surrounded by equipment that never fulfilled its lethal purpose. The war that drove Project Kugo's development is over. Japan has been defeated, not by microwave weapons or death rays, but by conventional military force, applied with industrial efficiency, and, in its final stage, by atomic weapons that represent a qualitatively different level of destructive capability. A deep, steady narration, with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. September 3, 1945. Shimada Research Facility. American intelligence officers arrive at the facility 2 days after the formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. Captain James Mitchell of the Army Signal Corps leads a technical assessment team tasked with cataloging Japanese electronic warfare research. They expect to find radar installations, perhaps radio jamming equipment, the conventional tools of signals intelligence. What they discover instead surprises them. A deep, steady narration, with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. A massive magnetron system, a partially completed 10-meter parabolic reflector, and meticulously detailed research documentation describing 5 years of effort to build what Dr. Yagi's reports simply call a directed energy weapon. Mitchell examines the equipment with growing interest. The magnetron technology is sophisticated, comparable to British cavity magnetron designs that revolutionized Allied radar systems. But this application, concentrating microwave energy into a lethal beam, represents something entirely different. The test results documented in Yagi's reports are simultaneously impressive and absurd. Killing a rabbit at 1,000 yards demonstrates remarkable electromagnetic power generation for 1945. Requiring 10 minutes to do so renders the entire concept militarily useless. They actually thought this could work? One of Mitchell's team members asks, flipping through pages of biological test data. Rabbits, groundhogs, detailed descriptions of internal hemorrhaging, tissue damage, thermal effects. The scientific methodology is rigorous, even if the strategic application was hopeless. Dr. Yagi, when interviewed, speaks candidly about the project's limitations. He knew from the beginning that the physics presented insurmountable challenges. The inverse square law governing electromagnetic radiation meant that extending range required exponentially increasing power output. Japanese industrial capacity, already strained by wartime demands, couldn't produce the components necessary to overcome these fundamental constraints. The multi-magnetron configuration planned for 1945 existed primarily on paper, an engineering fantasy that material shortages and Japan's deteriorating military position prevented from realization. The Americans confiscate the technical documentation and some key equipment components. The massive reflector, too large to transport easily, remains at Shimada, eventually scrapped for its aluminum content during post-war reconstruction. The research findings join thousands of other Japanese technical documents shipped to Wright Field in Ohio for analysis by American scientists and engineers evaluating enemy technological capabilities. November 1945. Technical Intelligence Summary. Wright Field. The classified report on Project Ku-go concludes that while the Japanese demonstrated significant expertise in magnetron technology, their directed energy weapon concept was never viable as a battlefield system. The report notes with professional interest that Japanese scientists achieved microwave power outputs at the leading edge of contemporary technology. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery, with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Under different circumstances, adequate funding, unlimited materials, peacetime research conditions, they might have made additional progress. But even optimistic projections suggested that a truly effective microwave weapon would require technological advances decades beyond 1945 capabilities. What the report doesn't mention, because the authors couldn't yet know, is that Ku-go represented an early exploration of concepts that would eventually become real. Decades later, microwave weapons would evolve into active denial systems, capable of dispersing crowds through intense heating of skin surface tissues. High-power microwave devices would be developed to disable electronics and disrupt enemy communications. The physics that Dr. Yagi and his team investigated in that converted textile factory would underpin genuine directed energy weapons systems, but these would require transistorized electronics, solid-state power generation, computer-controlled beam steering, and materials science achievements that simply didn't exist in 1943. Shimada, 1950s. The research facility returns to civilian use. The building that once housed Project Ku-go's magnetron equipment becomes a textile factory again, then later a warehouse. Few local residents know about the secret military research conducted there during the war. Dr. Yagi continues his academic career, his pre-war work on directional antennas ensuring his lasting reputation in electromagnetic theory. He rarely discusses Ku-go, And when he does, he emphasizes the engineering challenges rather than the weapon's intended lethality. The story of Japan's death ray. When it occasionally surfaces in technical histories or military intelligence retrospectives, serves as a cautionary example. It demonstrates the difference between theoretical possibility and practical implementation, between laboratory success and battlefield utility. It shows what happens when desperate military necessity drives research toward objectives that fundamental physics and engineering reality cannot support within available time and resources. The rabbit that died after 10 minutes of microwave exposure in June 1943 proved something important. That concentrated electromagnetic energy could kill biological targets at distance. But it also proved something more significant, that proving a concept in controlled conditions is vastly different from creating a weapon system that changes military outcomes. Project Ku-go succeeded scientifically and failed operationally, a distinction that defines much of wartime weapons development when urgency overrides physics. Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, ended not just the Pacific War, but also the brief, strange chapter of Imperial Japanese death ray research, a weapon that worked exactly as promised and remained completely useless because of it.